Hey all, your OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a revisited look back at the Google Pixel Slate. This is a Chrome OS-based tablet that had flagship ambitions from Google when it debuted in late 2018, but unfortunately, it was a commercial flop. In fact, the early reviews were so scathing due to the software experience being half-baked and surprisingly sluggish despite relatively performant internals that there were rumors for a while that Google would never make a tablet ever again. However, of course, later on, we did see the Google Pixel tablet 5 years later in 2023. So it took a pretty long time for them to kind of muster the courage to try a tablet form factor again. And although the Pixel tablet was much better received, also thanks to the more affordable price point, in some ways it's not quite as ambitious, I would say, as the Pixel Slate that was really designed as Google's alternative to something like a Microsoft Surface. And that's because it's running on the desktop class Chrome OS operating system using an Intel processor, compared to the Pixel tablet is running on Android. It's more mobile oriented, kind of like a grown-up version of a smart assistant display, rather than being positioned as a high-end laptop alternative, which the Pixel Slate was supposed to be. So it was unfortunate that the software that came out during launch was so half-baked. It was pretty much universally criticized by the entire tech community at the time. The curious thing is, for a software giant like Google, the experience was just so unoptimized. You can tell here during day one launch, everything was just shockingly slow in terms of animations, really sluggish, with inconsistent performance, sometimes feeling faster, sometimes feeling slow. It was really bizarre. But here's the thing, oftentimes when we review a product, we only use it for a couple of days and then share our impressions. But to Google's credit, the state of Chrome OS in terms of the software experience and optimization has actually improved the usability of this device significantly. It's just unfortunate that first impressions are hard to forget, which is why by the time those critical first reviews came out, it was already too late to drastically change the public opinion about this device, even though through subsequent software updates, because this thing is still receiving continuous Chrome OS updates to this day, now the usability and smoothness is much improved so many years down the road, which is why I wanted to take a longer term look back at this device and see how it's holding up, as well as whether it should still be worth considering, again here in 2025, since it remains the only Chrome OS operating system tablet from Google to date. Now, in terms of pricing, when it first debuted, it was definitely steep. There were a couple of different configuration models, and a entry-level Celeron version with only 4 GB of RAM definitely did not help, priced at around $600. And then other configurations, including the more popular Core M3 version that we have in front of us, sold at $800. There was another more powerful i5 and i7 configurations that can stretch northwards of $1,000. So again, definitely putting it in flagship tier, competing with the likes of the iPad Pro and the Microsoft Surface Pro devices. And yet, because of the poor reception of the Pixel Slate, you can now find these on third-party platforms like eBay for around $45 in used condition, which is absolutely in budget bargain territory. And these are fully functional working units. I picked up this one in front of me for the same cost just a couple of months back. So you get the idea, it's dropped to pretty much a tenth of the original asking price. Which is actually kind of funny, because if you're shopping for a traditional Chromebook in the fixed laptop form factor that has a keyboard permanently attached, many of those units that have similar specs are actually still more expensive than the Pixel Slate. So based on the hardware components inside, it's surprisingly become a bit of a steal in terms of the value proposition. That being said, prices of course will fluctuate, so if you're interested, make sure to act fast. And also, if you don't want to miss out on deals like this that I stumble across when shopping around, consider subscribing and watching our videos early to be notified of opportunities and deals like this when they come up in the future. Anyways, a couple of final top-line specs in terms of built-in storage. It came by default with 64 GB, although higher configuration models can go up to 256 GB. But just like the iPad and Surface, you can't really easily expand on the SSD. It's not user removable. And there also isn't a micro SD card slot in the design either, which is a little bit of a shame. Now the screen though is fairly high resolution, measuring almost 300 ppi and using a rather boxy, kind of unique 3:2 aspect ratio, also comparable comparable to the iPad compared to a wider, maybe 16 by 9 that's more conventional on most laptops. So just like the iPad, it's more comfortable for reading documents and browsing the web. This IPS LCD screen is further protected by Corning Gorilla Glass, and also again having a kind of 3K resolution, which is a bit unusual. It's higher than 2K, but not quite 4K, but definitely very crisp. And now a closer look at design, I will say that the build quality of the Pixel Slate does feel extremely premium, not super surprising considering it was a once flagship product. It's constructed out of this aluminum unibody back with just some embedded antenna lines on the left and right sides. It supports Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth, although Google never got around to releasing a cellular LTE version of the tablet. There's also an 8 megapixel camera on the rear, maybe for scanning in documents, feeling nice and sturdy. That being said, in terms of the aesthetics, I wouldn't say it's super unique or necessarily pops out. It is in this kind of monotone shade, which is a little unusual actually for Google's hardware division. For example, their Pixel phones usually have a visor design with more vibrant color options, as well as the Pixelbook laptop also introduced a similar visor design for consistency, which in my opinion just looks a little bit more striking compared to the Pixel Slate just having a completely flush design here on the rear. And in my opinion, also lacked the playful touches of the Google Pixel C Android tablet that came out before the Pixel Slate. This was their previous tablet attempt and had a kind of double knock light bar on the rear that you can see the battery percentage just by knocking. This functionality was removed on the Pixel Slate. And in some ways, ironically enough, the Lenovo Duet Chrome OS tablets that came out a couple of years later actually felt like a closer spiritual successor to the Pixel Vision because they had a visor design here on the rear, which again we don't see on the actual Pixel Slate. But regardless of the slightly plain back, it still felt very premium in terms of the hardware and the build quality. Here's also kind of a final size comparison with some of these other devices. So you can tell that next to the Pixel C, it is going to be substantially longer, just because this is a 10.2-inch Android tablet compared to the Pixel Slate being a 12.3-inch tablet. So it's definitely a plus or pro-sized device, but in terms of portability, it's not going to be quite as small and lightweight when used in the tablet mode. And here's also a final size comparison with the kind of base iPad, illustrating the difference between a 11-inch device compared to the 12-inch screen of, again, the Pixel Slate. So it's just going to be a little bit larger in terms of all the dimensions. Although if we were to compare it with something like a Microsoft Surface, you can see that it's going to be a little bit more closely matched in terms of the form factor. Now, maybe one hardware aspect that I wish Google would have incorporated, though, would be some type of built-in kickstand, kind of like the Surface that can just pop up at a more comfortable angle using a flexible hinge that can be positioned more forward or back. Compared to on the Pixel Slate, they went with just a keyboard case that had a more kind of flappy design with the kickstand. Didn't feel quite as stable, it just used magnets instead. Furthermore, the Pixel Slate's coating seems to attract fingerprints rather easily, but overall, again, it still has a clean enough design, I would say. And in terms of I/O, it's not too surprising, just like other thin and light tablets. It essentially only has USB Type-C ports, but on here there's two of them at least, one on the left, one on the right. So it can be used for charging, display output, data transfer, connecting to external SSDs, so on and so forth, as well as connecting a dongle for wired headphones, because there is no standard 3.5mm headphone jack on here either, which is a little curious. That being said, one hardware feature I do really like is the power button has an integrated fingerprint scanner. Interestingly, this is a feature that we still don't see that commonly, even on newer Chrome OS laptops and tablets, and I think makes it really convenient for just unlocking more securely using one touch. This was great to see. The bottom here just features the Pogo contacts for that optional keyboard accessory. Now again, the most common model that you can find when shopping around in the used marketplace, including the $50 versions that I mentioned earlier on eBay, are all the kind of middle of the road Intel Core M3, which is the 8100Y variant coupled with 8 gigabytes of RAM. And although by 2025 standards, that's no longer going to be the fastest Chromebook option available, it still is more than speedy enough to handle the basics. Navigating around isn't that problematic, especially compared to more entry-level models that are using even newer Celeron chips. Still are going to be slower, not to mention the base 8 gigs of RAM still helps it when it comes to multitasking, feeling quite smooth actually for a device now in the budget price range. And so again, credit to Google's part, they've been pushing continuous software updates to this platform since, of course, they have other partners making these devices and exploring this form factor. The Pixel Slate is able to take advantage basically of all those improvements, and now we're getting to a state where the animations finally feel a lot smoother. Now again, the screen quality on the Pixel Slate I think is still quite beautiful looking, offering accurate enough colors, as well as that impressively sharp resolution. That being said, of course, you don't get as inky blacks as a OLED screen, which you have on the Duet 5, for example, and also the brightness I do think can get a little bit higher, ideally in outdoor conditions. But if you're mostly using it in shaded regions or indoors, it's not that problematic. It's still a beautiful display overall. In terms of the touch sensitivity, like most 2-in-1 tablets, it supports both capacitive multi-touch as well as an optional stylus pen with pressure sensitivity using Wacom's AES standard. So aside from Google's official Pixel Pen, you can also pick up third-party options using this protocol like Wacom's Bamboo ink stylus pens that are also compatible, by the way, with the Microsoft Surface devices, and you'll be able to interact with the operating system in a slightly more precise way perhaps, as well as even utilize some of the newer software features that allows you to take a screenshot, annotate over it, and even access accessibility functions like a magnifying glass, in addition to a laser pointer mode that will shine this kind of red dot as you're swiping using the stylus, if you are maybe screencasting to an external display using Chromecast. So another complaint during launch was the note-taking experience felt more sluggish and laggy for some reason, just because of the poor software optimization. And thankfully, by 2025, with those incremental software updates, we've gotten to a state where the inking experience now feels more reliable and smooth. So here's a quick example. Again, we can just say something like, "Hello world," and as you can tell, there is very little lag or latency now. It follows the pen tip, plus because it is an active stylus pen, it has palm rejection as well. So if you put your hand down, you can still write over it, as you can tell here, doing a fairly good job when it comes to doodling and quick note-taking. Now we can also take a look at some other third-party inking tools, including Squid. So giving things another try here, again, it's following the stylus nib actually pretty well in terms of the sensitivity. We can draw more lightly versus a firmer line, and you can see the difference there in the pen stroke. Light versus dark shades also follow along as well, offering impressively low latency as well as good palm rejection. So again, for general note-taking purposes, honestly, it's reached a state now in terms of the software optimization, availability of third-party apps, that I don't consider it to be a weakness, especially now that it's a sub-$50 tablet. Likewise, navigation gestures, similar to Android OS, also feels a lot smoother in this day and age. Now, perhaps another complaint that reviewers had back in 2018 was the state of Chrome OS didn't seem perhaps quite as polished compared to other desktop-class operating systems like full Windows or Mac OS, despite the flagship hardware. However, to Google's credit, again, Chrome OS has also gained more features through subsequent updates. You're now able to install Linux containers if you want to explore more Linux applications, as well as you can always use remote desktoping functions built into the operating system now if you want to connect remotely to a full Windows computer. Furthermore, Chromebooks can now run full Android apps, including the full version of the Google Play Store, so you're able to leverage millions of mobile applications as well, including games, other reading tools, just unlocking more possibilities. So it's definitely evolved since the days of only being a Chrome browser. Likewise, on this version as configured, again with 8 GB of RAM, honestly I feel like it's running pretty smoothly as well, even for jumping through different applications here side by side, for multitasking. Yes, you might occasionally still see some micro jitters. It's not going to be 100% as buttery smooth as the latest iPad Pro, but considering this thing's age, I think it's actually improved compared to during launch. That being said, echoing a remark I mentioned earlier, because it is a 12-inch tablet, it does feel a little bit on the heavier side if you are holding it in your hands, although the larger screen size definitely makes it a joy when you are reading back documents, even looking at textbooks, for example, although putting it down onto a table or using it with a kickstand might be a little bit more practical when you are just generally browsing the web, since it weighs in at over 1.6 pounds. In terms of the battery capacity though, it is also fairly generous at 48 watt-hours. And so for light computing, such as reading back articles, browsing the web, looking at PDFs, I was getting around 6 to 7 hours on a full charge. Now, this might vary slightly depending on the battery health of your device for a used unit, but generally speaking, it wasn't that problematic. This particular used unit has over 140 cycles, but still retains a fairly high battery health percentage. Again, thanks to the fact that Google used rather premium flagship components when building this tablet. and that's echoed in the design elements like these front-facing stereo speakers on the left and the right of the tablet, also getting a little louder, more immersive sounding than most other budget tablets, for example. And also the front-facing selfie camera for video conferencing as well is also 8 megapixels, matching the resolution and quality of the rear camera. And as for the camera performance, even though it's nothing extraordinary, it gets the job done for a tablet for just basic document scanning. In fact, there's an extra mode built into Chrome OS's camera app now that can try and recognize the shape of pieces of paper. If the angle isn't completely straight, for example, you can still capture the shot and try to straighten it out using the software here. So it's actually working quite well in terms of text and clarity. Plus, using a stylus pen, you're able to annotate freely, sign documents as well. Gets the job done, I would say. Now, one thing I will say about Chrome OS is it does have this kind of cloud sync capability as part of the settings, which means that if you purchase a new Chromebook in the future, just signing in with your Google account, it will automatically sync over all of your settings, including your previously installed apps, your previous wallpaper, as well as your previous sign-in options. Kind of like when you buy a new iPhone or a new Android phone and you just transfer over all the stuff from your previous device. I think it's a good intent, generally speaking, although there are some weird edge cases. For example, if you have 2 Chromebooks, let's say this tablet plus a conventional laptop, well now all of a sudden both the tablet and the laptop are constantly syncing with one another, whereas maybe you want to set up the tablet to behave a little bit differently because of its form factor compared to the laptop. For example, the Pixel Slate has that unique fingerprint scanner for unlocking the device, which is often missing on laptops. But if you turn on the fingerprint unlock function in the device settings, because it's saved to your Google account, and then you go over to your Chromebook laptop, now it also requires you to sign in with your fingerprint or add a password before you can unlock into the system. Just because those settings are synced across all of your devices linked to your Google account. There's that synergy. So I kind of wish they would give us an option of kind of detaching them from one another. If you want to maybe have a different wallpaper on your tablet and then not have it automatically change to the same wallpaper on your laptop. So having some degree of independence and untethering those settings might be something to consider in future updates of Chrome OS, especially since this operating system has been out now for over a decade, and so it's increasingly likely that customers have more than one Chrome OS device. So giving some more flexibility there would be nice. But aside from that, overall it's still a pretty easy setup, just sign in and you're pretty much ready to go. And using Cog, we can also verify the system's stats. Now, under heavier load, if you've been using it for, say, more than an hour, running multiple tabs, watching videos, it does get a little bit warmer here on the back of the unit because of the Intel processor ultimately isn't as thermally efficient as a ARM chip, like a Qualcomm Snapdragon equivalent, even though the Core M3 should already be one of the more efficient options within Intel's catalog, especially at the time. Again, just like the iPad, it is a completely fanless machine. Jumping into YouTube, let's also see what the built-in stereo speakers sound like. Alright, so turning things down there, takeaway is it definitely gets louder and has that stereo separation effect, which is pretty immersive. That being said, the speakers are on a rather slim tablet at the end of the day, so it doesn't have as much bass or true depth. If you're comparing it with your Pixelbook laptop, it seems to have a little bit more punchy volume in terms of the low end, but all in all, definitely not bad and above average, I would say, for a tablet speaker. And you can definitely crank up the resolution, such as 4K here, and the overall playback still remains relatively smooth, thanks to reliable enough Wi-Fi connectivity, keeping things running without having to buffer for too long either. So generally speaking, it's still a pretty responsive experience, even if you're streaming 4K videos. Maybe the only asterisk though is, again, the more boxy 4:3 aspect ratio screen, if you are watching cinematic movies, has a little bit more letterboxing at the top and bottom due to the squarish form factor. But generally speaking, the screen is large enough that I don't find it to be that distracting, and overall I think it's still an enjoyable enough experience. Plus the benefit of this aspect ratio is you can run apps side by side and they feel a little bit more natural and seamless. So as you can tell here, you can change the aspect ratio of these two apps and everything still seems to keep up all right. Jumping into the Chrome web browser, this is really the bread and butter of Chromebooks and Chrome OS devices because it's the same desktop class browser that you find on a regular laptop, supporting all of the same extensions that you might be using, and just having support for optimizing these desktop versions of sites looking excellent and feeling the same as if you were running it on a Windows computer or a MacBook, macOS device. So as shown here, loading up different web pages still feels almost instantaneous, despite The Verge being a rather heavy site with plenty of different videos and ads being displayed, but still everything is loading at a very respectable speed, as you can tell here. And in my testing, the 8 GB of RAM was sufficient for opening up more than a dozen tabs in the browser, and then jumping back and forth between these tabs, everything was still loaded and kept in the system's memory. So overall, web browsing still feels quite comfortable, especially since this thing is more powerful at the end of the day compared to even newer entry-level Chromebooks, which still have only 4 GB of RAM in 2025, believe it or not. So by comparison, this still feels rather speedy and responsive, despite it having a standard 60 Hz refresh rate for the screen. Likewise, even if you're not using the first-party official Folio case, you can connect to Bluetooth keyboards and mouse, and when it detects a mouse that's been connected, it will transform into the more desktop-optimized mode, in addition to an app tray here on the left that you can click on to see all of your apps, universal search, and recently opened documents as well. And you can also open up multiple kind of environments as well for better multitasking. For example, a second desktop can be open now here if you want to run other applications and then jump back and forth between them, similar to on Windows and macOS. That being said, with the introduction of more and more software features, including built-in Gemini support now as well, with certain AI features powered by the large language model, it seems like Chrome OS is also consuming more resources. I still remember when this OS first came out, it was extremely simple, and even on really entry-level hardware like a Celeron processor, it was able to run very smoothly, but that is definitely not the case anymore. So as the functionality grows more mature, just like other desktop operating systems, you have to increasingly have more RAM, faster processors for the performance to keep up. Which is why, in my opinion, in 2025, you kind of need at least 8 gigs of RAM, funny enough, even on a Chromebook for it to run smoothly. So thankfully, those specs are still met on the Pixel Slate. So there's that dichotomy of wanting the product to run smoothly on less powerful hardware that I kind of miss from a simpler time. But I also understand Google's growing ambitions for this operating system, making it more and more competitive. Now here's also the kind of Google Documents suite. You can of course access Google Sheets for their version of Excel, as well as PowerPoints and Word documents, in addition to online versions of Microsoft Word and Excel, of course, can also be edited. So again, for these light computing and office tasks, it should be still sufficient. Something else that's kind of nice about Chrome OS is, again, the continued software updates are always rolling in the background of your device. So unlike Windows or Mac OS, where it seems to slow down the entire computer's performance, as well as require kind of some downtime when the computer is updating, with Chrome OS, it's just happening in the background. And once an update is ready, you just have to restart, and then the update is automatically applied. So it's a little bit more seamless about updates, which I do appreciate. And one thing that Google always touts with Chrome OS is the platform is a little more secure in some ways compared to Windows or Mac OS, probably because there's also fewer users compared to those more legacy desktop operating systems. But they claim you don't necessarily need as much antivirus software, for example. Now, if the platform continues to grow, I'm sure there's always going to be ways to try and exploit it down the line, but it was especially true in the early days, I would say, when it was really just a Chrome browser, since you couldn't really install apps as easily as on Windows or Mac, even if you accidentally downloaded something, for example. That, I guess, is still true to some extent, although now we do have the Android app support. Anyways, we can also see some of the resizable windows for split-screen multitasking, as well as being able to kind of freely drag these around. Again, just like most desktop class operating systems. Here's also a quick scroll through some of the recent updates with Chrome OS. So now there is a welcome recap function, kind of similar to Windows Recall. So it will also give you a snapshot of what tabs you were opening up on other Chrome OS devices, all synced over. A new focus mode as well that can be set, which will minimize distractions and notifications, being able to take screen recordings directly in the operating system, sharing files between Android phones as well as Chromebooks more easily, and also offering adaptive battery support. So if you're plugging it into a power outlet, it will try and charge to maybe only 80% to prolong the battery health, and when the power is under 20%, just like on an Android phone or tablet now, it will go into a power power saving mode, reducing the animation speed and brightness of the screen, and this power saving mode was previously missing on Chrome OS when it first came out. So these are all examples of continued updates, but of course with more and more software features, it also requires, again, more resources to run a more complex OS. Which is also why perhaps what once seemed like overkill specs on just a Chromebook back in the day, some people ask, why does it need a Core i5 or Core i7, is increasingly becoming more normalized as programs and features get heavier and require more resources to perform smoothly. So finally taking advantage of some of the specs that were maybe ahead of its time when it first came out. But otherwise, I can indeed confirm the performance has been pretty solid. There's really no app from the Play Store, for example, that you aren't able to install, whether it's from social media, even some light games. So here's a quick example of some Android games as well. Of course, everything is playable. You can use the touchscreen instead to navigate. So for light casual gaming, I would say it still is a sufficient experience. And if you want to get into slightly heavier gaming, keep in mind that this thing doesn't really have a powerful dedicated GPU or anything like that. So mobile titles primarily, you can always leverage cloud gaming options because it has a fairly reliable Wi-Fi connectivity. I was consistently getting almost full bars of reception, so you can easily use something like Amazon's Luna or Microsoft's Xbox xCloud, accessing more powerful hardware over the cloud, as long as you're connected to the internet and you're able to play back those heavier games as well. So here's another casual style game, and we can see how it performs just as reference, maybe some occasional drop frames, but overall not bad. Definitely still is a usable experience thanks to this beautiful IPS LCD screen that's extremely sharp. As long as you have reasonable expectations, it can still be a pretty enjoyable overall process. So we can also try loading up some reading apps like Webtoon, for instance. And once again, the super sharp display makes it a joy for looking at comics as well as documents here in general. Because of the larger canvas that you have to work with, everything just feels a little bit more luxurious, not quite as cramped. You're able to see details even without necessarily zooming in, making it a pretty enjoyable experience, I have to say. Now, maybe one of the final points to keep in mind would be the software update situation. So as of now, it's still receiving regular updates over the air, and Google has promised software updates continuing all the way to August of 2027. So for over 2 years, it will continue to receive the latest updates, software patches, gain new functionality, which is pretty good to see because honestly, there are still some budget, even mid-range Android phones and tablets that you can find now for around $100, $200 that don't provide you with even 2 years of updates when brand new. So it really still has some life left in it without too many issues. That being said, compared to the original Pixel Book, which was their laptop, it actually came out a year earlier than the Pixel Slate, but will still receive the same end-of-life date that has been extended actually by Google. So time will tell if they modify this date yet again, but that's the current situation. Would be nice if it lasted till 2028, although one thing I will say is even if the official software updates stop rolling along, the, of course, tablet will still be completely functional, all of the apps will continue to run just fine, and if you wanted to, you can always install something like Chromium OS. Using this open source version, it will receive even longer software updates, as long as the hardware itself is functional, of course. So yeah, this is a pretty interesting revisited look back at the Pixel Slate because it's one of the rare devices I think has improved after its release, making it actually kind of a hidden value or device that maybe many folks have forgotten about. Of course, it still isn't as polished as the latest iPad Pro in terms of frame rates, and the refresh rate of the screen is standard 60 Hz, but honestly, it's still a usable enough experience, very sharp and beautiful looking screen, again for documents and web browsing, some light entertainment as well, taking advantage of the ever-growing features in Chrome OS as it becomes more and more mature. Install Linux apps through a terminal or container built directly into the operating system, run mobile Android apps using the full Google Play Store, so on and so forth. It's become much more than only a Chrome browser. So in some ways, the Pixel Slate might have actually been ahead of its time, again, remaining a surprisingly usable experience. So just keep those expectations in mind as long as you're not trying to, again, press it super hard with AAA style games locally and running all of the heaviest editing tools locally. There's still sufficient workarounds that I think makes Chrome OS an interesting hybrid operating system that is surprisingly more usable than I think many folks give it credit for. So overall, despite being far from perfect, I would say the Pixel Slate definitely still has life left in it, and at its current price point, it's actually an awesome value, in fact, a bit of a steal. So you can check out more details if you are interested in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That was a revisited look back at Google's Chrome OS tablet, the Pixel Slate.